Hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Sarat Pediredla has joined me in the studio today. Welcome, Sarat.
Hi, Andrew. Great to be here.
Good to see you. I'm looking forward to getting to know you better today, as our audience is. We always start the show, as everyone knows, by you just introduce yourself. So please introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, everybody. I am Sarat Pediredla. I am the co-founder and operator of an AI-native digital product studio called Level 5, which is only 5 weeks old, so still living the startup life. I spent most of my career, probably the last 20 years, building as a co-founder, building and growing a digital product consultancy called Hedgehog Lab. Grew that from literally me and my co-founder to 150 plus people over the last 20 years through multiple private equity journeys, and obviously the latest thing I'm doing right now is my new digital product studio Level 5, which is quite disruptive in what it does as a consultancy. And I've always been an entrepreneur. This is actually my third business. My first business failed pretty horribly. So, when I was really young, when I was at university, obviously my second business did really well, grew it and scaled it. And now on my third journey, I live in the northeast of England. I have a family, married to a wonderful woman for the last 22 years, and also have 2 teenage children.
Super. And your answer to this is going to be very interesting because the entrepreneurs who answer this question tend to fall in 2 camps. So the question is, when you're not working, which I know you work a lot, what is it that you do as a sort of downtime, recharging the batteries? What's something outside of work?
It's a really good question, Andrew. So when I'm not working, I'm super eclectic. I like to exercise, to spend time out in nature, going to the gym. I love to read. Reading has always been my passion since I was a teenager. I spend time with my family, with my kids, lots of interesting hobbies, learning languages, doing pottery when I get the time. Again, it's very different. I think if you asked me this question 3 years ago, it would very much been work and maybe squeeze a little bit of my time in for my family. But right now, I have a lot of interest. For example, tonight, after we finish, I'm going to go and catch up with one of my books that I'm dying to finish in the last few weeks, and then have a packed weekend with the family in the weekend.
And knowing the audience that are watching and listening to this now, what's the one book recommendation that you would make that people definitely should read?
I mean, it's a cliche simply because both my current company and previous company was founded on the concepts. And so for me, the one book I would absolutely recommend at the top of everything is Good to Great by Jim Collins. It's pretty much shaped my business philosophy for the last 25 years and continues to shape it. And both my company's Level 5 is actually about the Level 5 leadership that Jim talks about in his book. And my previous company, Hedgehog Lab, is about the hedgehog concept, which again, Jim talks a lot.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you for that. I'm glad I asked you. So let's go back to childhood. And this is where a lot of our journey starts. So just describe what it was like for you growing up. How did those early years shape you?
That's a really good question. I think it's one of those great things where, again, depending on when you ask me this question, I might have had a different answer. I am quite fortunate that I've worked a lot on myself over the last particularly 3 or 4 years and really kind of reflected on my childhood through therapy, through coaching, etc. in terms of, where I was. Mostly I'd describe my childhood as pretty good, as idyllic as it can get. But it was shaped by a couple of critical events that I think probably really kind of got me into the journey that I did and where I went. I think the first thing was, when I was a child, I was always academically brilliant. And my parents, and again, another cliche, growing up in India, education and academic performance was quite high on the list of things that your family and your parents kind of cared for. And I was fortunate because while education has always been a priority in India, obviously not everybody can be academically brilliant. And I was fortunate in that I was really good academically. I was always kind of the number one student, achieving really high grades. And I enjoyed it. That's the other thing, because I think a lot of the time, when you're young academically, yes, you hear the stories where children do well academically, but they're pushed by their parents, they're forced to do it. But I really enjoyed it. So I think that was one thing that definitely shaped a lot of that. The second thing was I went to, as we would call it in India, I grew up in India, a residential school, or I think as you'd call it here, a boarding school. And that kind of, I think, shaped a lot of the journey because when I was growing up, you took that as normal. Like, of course, you went to boarding school if you wanted to be the elite and you wanted to achieve the best grade and the ranks, etc. But actually, what I've reflected now, and I think that's impacted my leadership journey, is it also brings you up in an environment, especially, in that academic competence, hyper competitive world where everything is about winning and about being the best, etc. I grew up with because in India you have big families. I grew up with generations of my family, very loved. I think one of the biggest decisions that shaped my life is when I was young, and I remember being really young, 4 or 5. So my ambition since I was young, and I can't decide how much of this came from my parents or how much it came from me, was everybody that knew me as a child, my ambition was to be a surgeon. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. I wanted to be a doctor. In India, there is a certain kind of reverence and respect given to particularly doctors and healthcare professionals, etc. And I think my parents certainly and my family saw that as the pinnacle of achievement to be a medical professional. You can make money, you can serve the community, you can do good. I was obsessed with becoming a doctor until I was 15 or 16. And then suddenly, I think when I was 16, I changed my mind and I said to my parents, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. I want to be a computer engineer or a software engineer. I said, nobody really forced me. It was what I wanted to do. And so as I stepped into adulthood and I started, I think it was probably the first time I thought, what is it that really drives me? What is it that I am passionate about? And when I was about 14, 15, I ended up getting a computer for the first time in my life. I've never had, and I didn't grow up with computers. I had one of those old like gaming systems, but it wasn't really a computer. And actually, the computer was bought because it was to prepare me for my medical school, my pre-med education, and there's just so much stuff to read and learn and videos to watch, etc. And ironically, when I got the computer to prepare for my pre-med, I ended up getting quite obsessed with effectively the computers. Taught myself programming, etc. And as I started to, I would argue 16 is when you start going to that young adult phase, because my first child has actually just turned 16 now. So you can recognize that. That was when I kind of, I guess, stepped away from that life script and said, I don't want to be a doctor anymore. What I want to do is software engineering. And that again, that was a big critical decision because in fairness to my parents, they were worried that this was it's almost like when you have this script and when you have this expectation for the last 10 years, it's difficult for people to readjust. It's difficult for people to change that expectation, and also then rationalize it to go, why have you suddenly changed your mind? And some of it was just because I just found, it's experiential. I found the experience with computers, learning programming, learning technology to be so fulfilling.
Super. And then, so you made that decision, and then just talk to us about what happened next.
It was difficult, in fairness to my parents. I think they were very worried because, again, historically, you're guided through those, educational years, by your parents. It was really difficult. But again, I remember those formative years where I was starting to, again, when you grow up in an Indian culture, it's very much, you have to do what your parents say, right? It's generally accepted that it's polite and respectful. And so that was a big transformation to go, no, actually, this is about what I want and what I would like to do. So it was quite disruptive for that. There was a little bit of unsettlement with my parents. And then eventually I decided that's what I'm going to do. The challenge was, even though I pivoted from medicine into computers, the expectation was, because I was so academically, gifted and I was brilliant, that the only way I would do computer science would be at the top. Like, for example, I would go to MIT, or, I would go to Stanford. And growing up in India, America was the destination, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, etc. The problem was I hadn't done any of the SATs. I hadn't, because I was preparing to do medicine. All my prep was in biology, etc. So I didn't really have the entry requirements to get into MIT. And while I was good with maths and physics, etc., I didn't really have the grades and the subjects, a bit like the A levels, to really get into computer science, because I've just, actually, I was 3 months into pre-med school when I quit and I decided I want to do computers. So that was really difficult. So it then became a bit of a compromise of, okay, well, if you can't get into the top schools in MIT, or maybe Oxford or Cambridge, or, like, what's the next path that you're going to find? And it was a bit of a compromise. And actually the plan was always to go to America to do medicine at Harvard. And that was kind of the ambition. And that actually brought me to one of my bigger second things in life, which has brought me to the UK, because when I was looking at some of the educational institutions in the UK and Southampton, where I ended up going, which I think is now called Solent University, but at that time was called Southampton Institute, the entry requirements were less stringent. I mean, you still needed good grades, you needed academic performance, but you didn't necessarily had to have maths, physics, chemistry, some of those core subjects that were on the pathway to being a doctor. And that meant, we reluctantly, to my parents, I took what was necessarily a backup choice, which is to come and do software engineering in the UK, as opposed to going to do computer science in MIT or Stanford.
And you talked earlier about the fact the first business you set up was when you were at university.
Yes, absolutely. And again, university was a really kind of interesting experience for me on two levels. It was the first time I was independent from family and parents. So I moved to a completely new country. I grew up in India, and actually I moved to Dubai when I was young, and that's where I lived with my parents for a few years. But it was all still in, boarding school. It was under a strict supervision from adults, and, it was all, there was very little independence, let's just say that, in the sense of, you know you were under certain structures and rules. And then coming into the UK in Southampton, it was completely, a new world. I was I think 17, just no 18, when I moved to the UK in 99, actually. So came to this new world, and university was a brilliant experience. It was a new way of doing things. I had to make decisions for myself, when, what to eat, what to cook, etc., and just kind of live independently. And that was a brilliant experience. I mean, academically, I was always good. I think the first couple of years of university, I was really, really good, and I was in the, top grades in everything I was doing in computer science. But while I was doing that, one of the things that I was always passionate about, other than technology, and when I started doing some of the tech work in my youth, once I decided not not to go into med school, was entrepreneurialism. In fact, I tried to set up a business when I was 16, when I lived in Dubai, which was like an e-commerce business. And I was really keen to take my computer skills and create like this online store, like Amazon, like thing in the Middle East. And my father had to basically talk me out and say, look, you need to go to university, you, you can't just do this straight out of high school. You need a proper education, you need a degree. So alongside learning computers, I kind of caught a bit of an entrepreneurial bug, because this was the heady days, post internet, 95, early Amazon, where, Silicon Valley was just kind of starting to come into its own. And anyone who was into computers was mostly entrepreneurial, exploring things. So when I came to the UK, the academic stuff lasted for about a year or two. And then almost in a way, the academic stuff ended up taking a secondary seat, because it was all about entrepreneurism. It was all about ideas. It was all about, you know, technically, I was still very good. I was teaching myself programming, and I taught myself. I think I ended up getting bored at university by kind of year three. because what they were teaching me I'd already learned 3 years ago. So it was never engaging to me. And I'd go in and they'd teach this programming languages, structures, and I'd go, I kind of know this and I want to spend my time applying it and building cool software products, etc. And that's when I had my idea for my first business, which was, I guess, as you a web-based CRM, so a bit like Salesforce. And I took a typical software engineer, technical person's approach to it. I built a great platform, but I had no clue how to sell it. I had no clue how to market it, and it was all about it's the idea of I'm a maker, the craft. I can build stuff, but someone has to buy it, and that business obviously failed miserably. But out of that business, I ended up getting, in those days in 2001, the UK was offering something called the Innovators Visa if you founded a new business. And I ended up getting an innovators visa. And although the business failed, I learned a lot from it. And that's kind of where my entrepreneurial journey really started.
Excellent. And at that point, even though obviously you'd wanted to go into this sort of computer science area, even at the age of 21, 22, as you had this experience, what was the dream at that point about what you wanted to do with your life? You'd moved to the UK. What was the dream at that point?
100%. The dream was to run a software business, right? I don't think, as a 21-year-old, I was particularly passionate about CRM. It was just a means to an end at that time. But the dream was to run a software business. Like I said, particularly if you live through the post-internet age, 1995, you're hearing these amazing stories about, what happened with PayPal, what was happening with Microsoft, the reinvention of Apple. And, I was massively into tech. And the potential was limitless, that you can build a software company and you can disrupt the market and you can build a billion-pound unicorn. So that was absolutely the dream. And I think I remember even when the company failed, I thought, I'm never going to work ever in my life. As in I would never be an employee. I will always run a business. And I'd caught the entrepreneurial bug, even though the first businesses failed.
So talk to us then in your own time about Hedgehog in terms of how it came about, the journey. It was a long time, as you said, which you built to the number of employees you talked about, and then how it came to a conclusion. Just talk us through that arc.
Yeah, Hedgehog was really opportunistic. So if you remember, I wanted to do software and that was my passion. But when the first business failed, as usual, you had to end up, making money in some way or format. But while that was happening, while the business was failing, I then met my wife, who was actually she was training to be a nurse in Newcastle, and we started dating, etc. And we were thinking about, I guess, getting married, and we then had that discussion of, she was training up in Newcastle. I was, I had a business down in Southampton, which at that time I didn't fail, but it was coming to a conclusion. And then we made the decision that I would move up to Newcastle. So I was kind of, between, as the business was failing, I was doing some contract work because software engineering has always been a valuable skill. I was doing contract work and eventually ended up getting into doing some consultancy work. But I was in Southampton, and then we decided to move up to Newcastle. I moved up to Newcastle. I knew nobody here, so I couldn't just go around and ply my trade. So reluctantly, I took up my only and ever job because, we were getting married. We wanted to buy a house. We needed the money, and my wife was just a student nurse, and she was coming out of it. And I say reluctantly because I never wanted to get a job like I am, and as my only ever boss would say, who I'm good friends with now, I was a terrible employee because you can't contain me. I don't like, structure. I don't like being told no. And I think I lasted about 10, 11 months there or something like that. And all it was for me was a footstep onto starting my next business. I didn't know what it would be. And then the business I went into was an agency. It was a consultancy. It was a services business. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, I can do this, right? You're effectively selling skills. It's a skills arbitration system. And, I can do it. I have a lot of philosophy and thinking by then that I developed because I'm an avid reader. I'd read Good to Great, etc. I had a philosophy for a type of company that I wanted to run, particularly professional services that put people first. And again, when we started Hedgehog Lab, one of our values was people are our greatest assets. If you look at that now, that seems like such a cliche. Everybody says that. But in 2004, 2005, when we were thinking about the company, not a lot of people were saying that. And certainly not in professional services. The whole image of professional services, which still exists now, is you work people to death, you treat them as, resources, assets, you get young people, extract the most out of them, build them out, etc. And there was this idea that me and my co-founder Mark, who had met while I was at the agency, of, well, first of all, we can do this. We're capable. We were selling services. And then, we think there is a better way to do this, in a way where we treat these human assets as more valuable than how they were traditionally treated in professional services. And I think within a year of being there, I decided to quit and set up Hedgehog Lab. And that was kind of the germination of the business. But ironically, one of the stories of Hedgehog Lab that I think, is not well known is Hedgehog Lab didn't start out as a consultancy or a professional services business. It started out as a products business. That was the original thinking. We were trying to build. So Hedgehog Lab was incorporated in November 2006 and properly founded in May 2007. And the idea was to build software for the financial services world. So in my previous agency, I'd done a lot of work with banks and financial services companies, and we'd seen a gap in the market. The problem was when we started doing the work in May 2007, obviously the big run on Northern Rock ended up happening soon. And the whole financial services market went into meltdown. So we almost accidentally pivoted into doing agency or professional services because that wasn't always the intent. But I've always been entrepreneurial, and the decision was either, okay, well, my second business fails and we just shut it and I go and find a job. And I was too stubborn. I said to Mark, I'm not getting a job. I'm just going to figure this one out. And luckily he decided to stay and we figured it out between both of us.
How did you decide between the two of you what roles you would play as the business was to grow?
To be honest, in the early stages, we didn't. And I think, one of the lessons I've definitely learned is we were 50-50 partners. We kind of felt our way around it. We didn't really have honest conversations. I think in those early years, I'd only known Mark for about a year then. So we didn't even really know the relative strengths and weaknesses of each other. We were excited. I was 25 when I founded the company. And Mark was similar. I think he was a couple of years older than me. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of enthusiasm. There was a lot of, I don't really care, if I lose my mortgage and house and, we'll just live on beans on toast. So we didn't really. And I think that's been a big problem in that business, in that we never really had an open and honest conversation. So we kind of naturally just evolved into the roles. And because I was the deeper thinker and I've always been a growth mindset guy. I pushed myself. And in fact, I remember I tell this story all the time. The day we founded, we decided to do it as a consultancy. I turned around to Mark and said, how do you do sales? Like neither of us knew. And it was typical, it was a bit like my previous business. We were very good technically, but we had no idea on how to run a business. And I think the roles devolved because I guess naturally I found myself wanting to push myself and grow. And because I think deeply about how the business should work, etc., I ended up taking the natural CEO role. Because if I remember when we founded, I didn't have the CEO job title. It was my idea, it was my business, but we were just calling ourselves co-founders. And then naturally, in the first kind of year or so, those roles started kind of solidifying when we said, look, what do you want to do? What do I want to do? And we just got, it just naturally kind of pivoted into that.
And over the 20 or so years, what were the key events that happened during that business and what were the learnings from those?
Gosh, a lot of key events, really. And I think the first one was obviously the big financial crisis, which means we had to pivot the business the first time. The second one was I ended up getting bowel cancer when I was 29. It was pretty bad. It was, I think, like stage 3. So in the matter of months, and we were a small business. We were about 6 people in about, at around 2010. And obviously the cancer started 6 months early. And that devastated the business because I was the commercial guy. I was the product management guy. I was the project management guy. We were 6 people. Most of them were engineers. And like the business was reliant on me to grow and drive the business. And luckily, I can't speak highly enough of the NHS, and I appreciate, 2010 was a very different time to where it is right now. But I got treated, I got well, I went through my chemotherapy, and I came back to work. And it was existential. Like, I remember we literally had to figure out whether we're going to shut the business or not after building it into a small business over the last couple of years. And we decided to pivot the business again. We couldn't continue the way we were doing it because, we were just a web agency at that time, and we were a commodity, and everybody was, websites were selling for a dime a dozen. And, everybody, a kid in a bedroom was doing websites. So we decided to pivot the business into a mobile app consultancy. And almost, the reflection was, I need to build a business here and not just me with a bunch of people just working for me. And that really kind of kicked the business on. And that was really kind of the big growth phase of the business. I think it took us a couple of years. It didn't really get on until 2012, because by the time I had treatment, I came back, it was late 2011 by the time, I settled back into the business. So we started again. So we pivoted again from a traditional web agency into a mobile consultancy. And probably around 2016, we reached kind of a crescendo where the company was well known. We were generating good work. We had a big team. I think at that time we were 40, 50 people. And then private equity came knocking on the door in 2017 because mobile apps were really like hot. Everybody wanted to be in that space, etc. And that kind of started the growth journey. And since then, we've gone through, another, private equity journey, 2 more rounds of funding, and just continue to scale the business out.
Might be an interesting point here where people listening to this who are maybe just at this inflection point that you were at, where they're considering private equity. Just talk to us about how it was feeling at that point when you were making the decision to get external finance. And again, what was the learning? What may have done differently in terms of looking at it?
That's a really good point. I mean, irony is we didn't actually set out to get private equity. One of the reasons I needed money was we were trying to grow the business in the US. We were trying to launch the business in the US. And I needed, I think, about £250,000 cash just to hire the American, person, a little bit of cash in the US business. But the problem was nobody was willing to give us £250,000 because, unless you're going to mortgage your house, etc., which we didn't want to do. And I just found out business financing. I mean, until then, we just run on our own cash. We never had to get funding. And it was a really difficult time. And in the Northeast, we had these European funds, which we went into. But they because of Brexit, obviously 2016, we couldn't get the funds. So actually, it was almost an accidental thing where we were looking for £250,000 loan or money. And we got introduced to the private equity person. And they went, well, actually, you know what? That's too small amount. Have you got growth ambitions? Why don't we give you like £1,000,000 because people are really excited? So I think the first lesson is I accidentally fell into private equity. I didn't plan to go to private equity deliberately. We needed some money. And, for example, when we did that first time, we didn't even run a process. We didn't do a competitive process. We just took the money from the first person that offered it to us. And I think that's something I certainly would change. I did change because I went through the private equity journey and we did it properly. We got corporate finance. We sorted it out properly. The other reflection was in those years, and again, in the agency and consultancy world, private equity is everywhere now. In 2016, it was rare. There were very few companies. There were the really big scale companies in the US and stuff. And actually, we were a small company. I mean, I remember people going, wow, why is a small agency in the northeast of England taking private equity money? It's like, it wasn't the standard. Now it's the standard, like almost every, consultancy worth its time is taking that. And for me, I think I don't, well, I said, while I reflect on I could have done the process better, I don't, I think it was absolutely, and a lot of other agencies said, well, why are you willing, why? Because a lot of founders are worried about giving equity away, but it's about, the decisions and the trade-offs that you make. I don't think the company would ever have scaled out and been as ambitious as it was if I didn't take private equity. But, I would have gone into it a bit more eyes wide open rather than just taking the money because it was setting a particular objective. But overall, I think, it's been good experience with private equity for me.
And then in those last few years, as you got the investment and you grew the US and you started to get more people, I think you said to over 150 people, what were you learning about you as you were maturing as a leader? And what were you having to to look at in terms of the challenges you were facing purely as a leader?
Almost everything. We went through, probably one of the toughest times in my career, which was COVID. We were severely impacted. I think we lost about 70% plus of our business. And I don't know, I reflect on it because I became a founder so young, and because I didn't have to answer to anybody, and because I had a modicum of success. I wouldn't say I was hugely successful, but I had a modicum of success. I think it feeds your narrative and your story because, I was a perfectionist growing up because I was academically brilliant. I had low tolerance for mistakes or other people. Competitiveness was like through my blood, like everything was competition. And when we went through that COVID period, it was horrible. Like it was probably one of the worst times in my life, other than when again we had something similar happened in 2023. And it kind of forced me to grow up. You know, I've always been keen on things like leadership. So as I grew the business, I thought deliberately about organizational design. I thought about leadership. I constantly learning, challenging myself. But I think, 2020 was when I like properly grew up. I think, like I said, while I set the business up and I grew it, I never really had to exercise my leadership muscle. In 2020 I had to from every angle, making critical decisions, decisions that might impact loads of people's lives, decisions that might impact the future of the business, having to deal with private equity at that time. There's one thing, private equity, as I said, are great, but if you lose 70% of your revenue, private equity don't like that. And no investor likes that. I don't like it. And trying to juggle all these complex stakeholders, my customers, my team, etc. I had to grow up pretty fast in that time. So that was a big step change. And I think how I showed up as a leader, but also it meant I went through a really difficult time. And then, almost the light bulb went off where I go, if I can't look after myself, it was probably the first time I went to therapy in my life. If I can't look after myself, I'm not going to be able to show up as the leader that people want me to. So that was a big defining moment. And we had a very similar situation in 2023. After we, did our second private equity deal, the market completely tanked, like the whole consultancy market. It's a well-known thing. Accenture ended up making 10,000 redundancies about, a few weeks after we did our deal. And that was really, really difficult because, we just bought a company, we scaled the company up, and then you were suddenly thinking about making people redundant. And it was just a really difficult time. So for me, the most growth I've experienced as a leader is in both of those periods, really.
And then the last 3 years just brings us up to date in terms of obviously a lot's happened, and then obviously building into what it is you're doing now.
So the last 3 years, and so 2023 was I think, for me, a pivotal time in terms of how I saw my life. I think, because I was a perfectionist, and I think my identity was so tied into the business that in some ways, I think, and there's not necessarily wrong or right. I became the business, right? Like I was imbued in Hedgehog Lab was Sarat and Sarat was Hedgehog Lab. And from 2023, I really started to reflect and go, like, where is this going? Is this right for me? Just all those things, starting to put the work in. And that's why I said pre 2023, if you ask me, I was a workaholic. Like you wouldn't find me doing anything other than work. My identity was defined by my work and my worth as a CEO and as a co-founder. After 2023, both because I'd done the work and I'd steadily started to reflect, and also because it was just one of those crossing the chasm moments, I just completely started to rethink, both professionally and personally, wanting to become a better friend, a better father, a better, and really putting that work in. And that allowed me to, in some way, over the period of 3 years, separate myself from this identity of the business is me or I am the business. And even though we were a big company and we had private equity, I don't think I ever did that separation. And once you do the separation, then you start wondering what's next, like, I'm not tied into this, this is not my sole responsibility. And that allowed me to put a succession plan in place. In 2024, we went out to get a great managing director called Malcolm Seagrave. The ambition was to, initially I handed over the business to him and he ended up being the only report to me. And then when that started working, the natural step then became, let's just move it forward. And I want to figure out who I am outside this identity of this singular business that has basically commanded most of my adult life. And end of 2025, I decided to fully exit the company, and set sail and see where I'm going. And here I am.
Super. So question for you now, in the third iteration of this, in terms of the third business, how are you different now as you're showing up as the founder of this business compared to maybe Hedgehog?
100% different. 100% different. I think, well, three things I'd say. The first thing is, because of my perfectionism, I almost never allowed myself to show any flaws. Now, just to be clear, I was hugely flawed, and most of my employees and friends, and Alan, I ironically used to work with me at Hedgehog Lab 11 years ago. So it wasn't that I wasn't flawed, but I couldn't accept and allow myself to show the flaws, right? If you point out those flaws, I would get really defensive and I would almost dissociate from that flaws, because that wasn't my picture of who I was as a person. I was this perfect, amazing, incredible CEO and leader. So I'm, as Carl Jung says, I'm now fully integrated. Both my shadow and my light is integrated. And I recognize that I am just an average human being. I am a leader. I am flawed. I am not perfect. I make mistakes. And I accept it. I'm a lot more accepting of that. That means the critical part doesn't take over both my own, the way I show up, but also how I lead other people. So that's been really positive. I think the other thing I talked about, a healthy work-life balance. I call it, I mean, people call it midlife crisis. I call it a midlife renaissance, right? Because I turned 45 a few months ago. I am a much more whole-rounded person because, again, if you ask me that question, if you met in a pub and said, what do you do outside work? I'd have a pretty flat answer for you. Not a lot. I'd make something up like, oh yeah, I spend time with my kids or something. But really, I didn't quality time. Whereas now, absolutely, I have a thriving friend circle. I have an identity outside work. I pursue hobbies. I don't tie my identity into whether level 5 will be successful or not. But I'm also, much more curious and compassionate. I have on my desk the 15 commitments of conscious leadership, which is some of the work I did. And I try to follow that in a way where, I don't jump to judgment. I try to take responsibility for what I do. So very different, in terms. And then thirdly, from a professional perspective, I think, I can deploy all that experience and capabilities I've learned over the last 20 years. It's no surprise that we're 5 weeks in and the business is doing really well. It wasn't an accident. The last two times it was an accident. The fact that Hedgehog Lab in those years did well was purely accident. We just figured this out. Whereas now I have a very kind of grounded, realistic view of what's possible and what we can do.
One final question for you, because we are now at the point of looking at the future. If you think about the next few years, the next chapter of your life, what is it that you're going to make the biggest impact in, you think, in terms of how you show up?
That's a really good point. I mean, the best way I can summarize it, one of my mantras at work is I almost, when you think about performance management, etc., I try to grade myself against those 15 commitments of conscious leadership. Am I showing up, with integrity, with responsibility? Am I accepting mistakes? Am I accepting, what's my side of the street, etc.? So it's really just kind of taking all those growth and those learnings, because I said I'm an avid reader, so I used to read for a long time. But the problem is, you read stuff, but you don't actually implement it. You don't execute it. Whereas now I feel like I'm executing it. As an example, I have a co-founder in this business. We had the difficult conversations up front rather than trying to feel our way around it. We have a founders agreement. We have a monthly check-in where we really kind of talk about the things that were uncomfortable. And one of the things that I was really poor at was having uncomfortable conversations. So I can show up in a much more, I guess, just as a natural human, neither the perfect version or neither the flawed version. And hopefully that helps me, be a better leader and be a better team member, really.
Super. We've come to the end of our time together, so I really appreciate you being on the show together. It's been lovely to hear your story, the 3 different businesses that you've been involved in. And thanks very much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. As you can see, I really enjoyed talking. I love talking, so I really appreciated it.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.